Hey guys, how you doing? Today I want to talk about the CTV lady that was complaining about her parents' estate tax bill. You may have seen the story.
Her parents as hard workers who saved to buy a cottage in 1998 and always put money away in their RRSPs for their retirement. 5 years ago, they sold their home and made the cottage their principal residence. When they both died last year, Gallia's mother's RRSP rolled into her father's for a total of $715,000. When her father died, the RRSP had to be taxed as income at about 50%, and there was capital gains on the cottage. The family had a tax bill of $659,000.
It made me more angry than anything. We've just lost both of our parents inside of 11 months.
And I just want to dig a little bit deeper into what actually happened because they didn't really tell the whole story, and they just sort of made RSPs out to be the enemy because her parents passed at a young age. I'm really sorry for your loss. It was very unfortunate. They both passed away in their early 60s. But let's dig a little bit into the scenario so we can understand what actually happened and how to potentially plan around this. Because I was just reading this book, The Happy Inheritor, and if they would have read it, if they would have talked about it, they would not be unhappy inheritors because they would have known and expected this to potentially happen. So in 1998, her parents bought a cabin, and I don't know what the price was in 1998, but in the year 2000, they decided to sell their primary residence, which would have been completely tax-free upon sale, and move into the cabin, which from 2020 until 2025 became their principal residence. So any growth between 2020 and 2025 would have been completely tax-free. However, between 1998 and 2020, there would have been a capital gain on the growth from the purchase sale to what it was worth in the year 2020. We also know that when her mom passed away first, her RSP rolled into her dad's for a combined total of $715,000. So if you look, when somebody passes away and it can't roll over to the spouse, then the RSP is deemed as sold on that day. All of it is treated as income. You need to pay tax on all of that amount as income. So in this case, it was $715,000 worth of income in Ontario, taxed at whatever rate that was, which worked out to an average of 47.29%. So the tax bill on that $715,000 RSP was $338,154,000. She has also stated that her entire tax bill was $659,000, basically suggesting that the entire RSP is gone because there was a tax bill of almost the entire amount of the RSP. So the remaining amount that was owing was $320,846. Now, so what has happened if there was no other assets at all, and it's sort of saying there isn't. I have to assume there's probably some cash left over from the sale of the house, but let's just pretend there wasn't. Then what had happened was between 1998 and 2020, the value of the purchase price to the value of the cottage in 2020 had increased by $1,198,528 because they were going to be paying the highest marginal tax rate in Ontario on the capital gains on that cottage on top of the RSP, which is 53.53%, but capital gains are taxed at 50% of that, so 26.77%. So basically, if they bought it for $1 million, in 2020 it would have been worth $2.198528, and then whatever it was worth after that is going to be tax-free. So in other words, there's a potential that they have, a very, very sizable multi-million-dollar cabin that they had to pay about $300 and something thousand worth of tax on, which isn't too bad. So you need to understand that this wasn't just the RSP. The parents obviously weren't going to have time to do an RSP meltdown. The RSPs in their case did not work, unfortunately. This is just something that happens with her mom was a nurse. The pension wouldn't have worked out either. There would have been some things to complain about because they didn't live old enough to really use their pensions, which the RSP is meant to do. You're supposed to get more back in tax when you put it in and pay a lower rate over time as you're pulling it out. Now, that being said, they should have had a conversation about this cottage and if they wanted to keep it in the family, because cottages are by far and away the most complex issue for average Canadians with multi-generational sort of inheritances and estate plans, because there is going to be a big tax bill if you don't want to sell it. Do both kids or multiple kids want it? Do the grandkids want it? How are you going to pay the bills? Who's going to use it? All of these things. That is why it is my opinion that you need to have a family meeting about what you want to do with the cottage if you have one, because you guys all need to be on the same page about what's the potential tax bill going to be, who's going to want to use it, who's going to maintain it, all of those other things. Do you want to sell it beforehand? And lastly, I guess I'll just explain a few ways that you could have discussions and plan around this. So one of the things that they potentially could have done is when they sold their house, it was completely tax-free from what they purchased it for to what they sold it for. And if the capital gain on the cottage between 1998 and 2020 would have been higher than what the growth of the house was, then they could have made the cottage their principal residence for that time and paid capital gains on the sale of their house, because you can choose which property you want to be the one that's your principal residence, even if you aren't living in the cottage full-time at the time. So they could have done that. They could have done an estate freeze at the time, which would have meant that they would have had to pay the taxes on, the capital gains and then anything further, which in that case probably wouldn't have worked. And lastly, another option that you can consider, especially since the parents were young, is you could have considered doing some sort of life insurance policy that was going to be a permanent insurance policy for the expected tax bill. That way, when you pass away, the life insurance pays out, gives you a lump sum of money that you can use to pay the taxes. That way it doesn't force you to sell the cottage. So there's a few options. There's a whole bunch of things to consider when it comes to cottages. I just thought that they did kind of a terrible job of covering this story and just made it look like this girl's parents' RSPs were the worst thing that ever could have happened to her and her brother, when in essence they, just weren't left with a whole bunch of money, but they were left with a very, very expensive and probably amazing cottage that they can use. So once again, sorry for your loss. It's terrible. But there are things you can do to plan around this, and I just didn't think they really dug deep enough into what actually happened. So thought I'd let you know. Cheers.